Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. This time we have a pretty interesting topic at hand. I got a question on Instagram, I think, and the question is it worth trying to get into comics? I would love to draw comics as a job in the future, but I keep hearing it's not a good industry to get into right now. But I also see lots of comic artists making money online and seem to be doing just fine, so I'm not sure what to think. And that was the question. It's a good one, and this is obviously concerning the financial viability of a career in comics rather than the emotional fulfillment of just doing it either as a pure hobby or as a side gig for fun, regardless of how much money you make from it, or at least that's how I understood the question. So I won't touch on the is it worth it mentality wise or like fulfillment wise, and just for any newcomers who don't know my work from before, hello, I'm Minna Sundberg, and I go by Hummingfluff on most of my social medias, and I've been making comics as my full-time job for the last 7 years, I think. Specifically, I've been doing my own comic called Stand Still, Stay Silent, and you can read it online for free. There's a link in the description, or you can just Google SSSS and comic and you should find it. A bunch of S's. And also the art that I'm making in the background is for my comic, so that's I guess a sneak peek. A little bit of the style that I have going on for me. Anyway, that's who I am, for anyone who doesn't know me. So, comics as a career path. Well, you probably would think that I would say that it's a fantastic idea and a great career to strive for, since I'm personally enjoying it a lot as a job and doing fairly well. And I will give a positive take at the end, so don't get too discouraged. But the I would say objective truth is that comics right now, at least, is a very unstable, low paying, yet somehow really competitive field in most cases compared to like many other things you could pursue as an art career. If you're a good artist with a good work ethic, you would probably do way better trying to pursue a career in, I don't know, animation or working for video game studios. Even use like tiny indie game studios. You don't even need to go for the big ones to make well, better money than doing comics. Or just doing fan art. Honestly, like fan art commissions are a big thing that way more people make way more money from. Furry commissions probably even. Like comics in the art field are almost at the bottom as far as stable careers and a source of money goes, at least from well, my and many other people's experience, because honestly there's just not very little, there is a very little, I can't say this sentence, there is not a lot of money going around in comics in general, at least in the western part of comics industries. I don't know like about the Asian comics market, like manga and stuff. Maybe it's more lucrative, But yeah, the Western comics world, there's not too much money going around. And well, other than, the super famous Marvel artists who make hundreds of thousands a year just from licenses and stuff like that, because they created famous characters and people line up for, 2 hours just to get their autographs at comic conventions. Like that kind of comic artists, they obviously have very stable, good careers. But for the most part, yeah, it's slim pickings. Because if you follow a lot of comic professionals on social media or like read articles that they write in like comic publications online and otherwise, you probably have seen that anytime the discussion of page rates and money and anything related to that comes up, most people, even artists who are successful in the sense that they have won awards and they have tons of published books in bookstores and stuff, most of them still complain really, that they are very often stressed about money. It's hard to get well-paying work in the comic industry, and royalties are really bad, and you're basically just doing it almost for like portfolio fluff a lot of the time. And like people who do anthology books, like you can see a lot of successful looking anthologies on Kickstarter and stuff, they pay like nothing. You might get $200 for making 10 pages to have in those books, and you're basically getting published in a way. And you might say that my comic is in a book that sold thousands of copies, but you only made a few $100. Like that's the reality for a lot of semi or professional comic artist cases, I guess. And even the people who make okay money, they still only make okay money, as in almost poverty rates in many cases. So the reason for this, as I said, is that there's not a lot of money simply in the comics industry. And you might think that sounds weird because comics is a thing that's everywhere. Like everyone knows about comics. They're a big thing in culture in general. But if you think about it, about all the people you know and people in general, like kids, middle-aged people, old people, how often do they buy or even read a comic compared to how much people consume every other form of entertainment? Like the average person might watch a dozen TV shows or movies every year and buy 10 video games and spend $100 on one of those mobile games, or listen to hundreds of songs every year. And books, people listen to audiobooks in the car all the time. They might listen to stacks of books every year. But comics, maybe you read one graphic novel a year because someone bought it as a gift. Very few people who aren't into comics as a hobby actually read them. And therefore they also don't buy them. And therefore money doesn't get into comics. That's the equation here. And I just recently read that the total sales of I think the North American comics industry, I guess that's USA and Canada, which includes all of the Marvel and DC comics and successful Image Comics publications like The Walking Dead and stuff, it was just over $1 billion, which sounds like a lot, but if you think about how many comics that's like thousands of different published comic books and graphic novels every year, making that much combined. And then you think of a single Marvel Disney movie. Like, what's the biggest one? I had to check real quick. It was Avengers Endgame, made $2.7 billion. That's one movie. Made almost 3 times as much as all of the comics in 1 year. And not just Marvel comics, Marvel, DC, plus everything else. That is really bad. For comics, that is. And that really shows, like, people know comics exist. Like, obviously the successful movies this year and last year have all been the comic book based movies from Disney and Marvel. People know about comics, and they're a cool thing to be a fan of, I guess, but to actually read comics, nah. People just go watch the movies instead. And that's the case for the Marvel comics. Think about how bad it is for indie comics. It's really bad. So I think that's maybe enough of the discouragement, and just giving out the harsh reality that it's not a great career to pursue if you don't have a backup plan or just a great plan in general. Like, you know your comic is gonna do well. But I'm gonna give the positive side of the possibilities, because obviously there are ways to make a nice, prosperous career making comics. Because as the person who made the question said, there are tons of indie artists making money from their comics, especially online these days. And it's not just old-timers who got famous back in the days, decades ago. It's new people every year getting into it and building a fan base and making money. Because if you make your own comic and you self-publish it one way or another, and you're able to build up a small but invested reader base, that is all you need for success. Your own comic that you self-publish and a small reader base. Or even a fan base, I would say, because you need people who are actually fans of your comic. Because let's think about a couple of number experiments. Case 1 is you go the old-time route. You make a graphic novel, 120 pages, full colors, softcover, and you manage to get it traditionally published, which, sounds really cool, and people will think you are successful now. And it's sold through comic book stores, and it gets into libraries and even normal bookstores like, Barnes and Nobles, I guess is the American one. And your graphic novel sells 10,000 copies at $15 a piece. And that would be a huge success for a graphic novel, 10,000 copies. I just checked the stats for last year on comicron.com, which is a website that publishes the sales numbers for comics in America. And only 26 graphic novels reached that kind of numbers for last year, 10,000 copies sold. For example, Walking Dead Volume 30 sold 14,000 copies. So that tells you something about the ballpark of how successful you need to be to sell that kind of numbers through stores, through a publisher. And but if you sell those 10,000 copies you don't actually make that much money in most cases. Because usually royalties for books, I think it's the same for normal novels, but graphic novels is usually at most 10%. So let's say 10%, you would make 15,000 bucks for the whole year from that graphic novel that you spent the whole year making, 120 colored pages. And it was a huge success. That's not a lot of money. And what if you only sold 5,000 copies, half of that, which would still be considered a good, respectable sales number? You would only make half of that, like 7,500. You can't live off that kind of money. And yeah, that's what you would make from a fairly successful graphic novel. But now let's do it the other way. You self-publish, and you just sell it through the internet, as I guess most new comic artists do nowadays. And you build your own reader base, either by posting your comic as a webcomic as you're making it, which I guess is the most common way of doing it nowadays, or you build a following just by posting your art in general, like on Instagram or Twitter or DeviantArt or YouTube or everything combined. And for the same 120 page graphic novel, you would be able to keep $10 for every book you sell, because you're not giving anything to a publisher or a distributor or this bookstore or everyone else who is involved in the publishing thing. You do everything yourself. You keep $10 of the $15 that it sells for. $5 goes into printing and everything else. So you only need to sell, let's see, 1,500 copies to get the same 15 grand you would have made from the 10,000 copies through the publisher. And 1,500 copies is, it's still respectable. It's tough to sell that many independently, but it's very modest compared to the nearly impossible 10,000 copies you would have to do. Like, it's way, way easier, or like common for webcomic makers, for example, to sell 1,000 to a couple thousand or 5,000 copies than it is to sell 10,000 copies through bookstores and stuff. So, that's still not much of a living, 15 grand, at least in many parts of the world. But that's just book sales. If you own your own comic, and a lot of webcomic artists in particular make a huge part of their income from, other sources still related to the comics. Like Patreon is a big thing. Some webcomic artists make all of their money or can live completely off Patreon. Or they do t-shirt sales related to the comic, or prints, or go to conventions with their comics and stuff, and have tons of extra income from it. And that's something you can do when you own your own comic, and you also have direct access to your fan base. You're not going through a publisher where they control everything. You have control. So that sounded like it's really easy to just sell a bunch of books if you go independent. That's not what I'm trying to say. It's still very competitive. Like there's probably hundreds or thousands of decent webcomics. Well, maybe not thousands of decent webcomics. Let's say hundreds of decent webcomics and indie comics that even though they are okay, they never really grow enough of a following to make any money. You still need a combination of good enough art, story and characters that will grab people, lots of work actually drawing it, for free before you have a fan base, and promoting yourself, that's very important. And even when you do everything correct and your comic has the potential to be successful, it usually still takes several years to grow a reader base. Like the beginning is usually very, very slow because you are just shouting into the wilderness, I guess is the saying, because you don't have a fan base yet. That's how it works with any art career, obviously, but yeah, it's the same with comics. But so even though I'm not saying it's a easy route, what I am saying is that there can be a very stable and financially viable career at the end of the tunnel. So, it's rare to get there, takes a lot of work, but it is possible. And if you have a good idea for a comic and you're willing to do it, like, I would definitely say try it out. Don't quit your day job if you have one. Not until you kind of have like a fan base growing and you can kind of see that this is going to happen. You don't want to get into a position where you think your idea is great and then you quit your job with, like, I don't know, a year's worth of savings, and then you work on your comic and you realize that your idea isn't that great actually. Maybe a year is too early to tell. Like, at that point, even a good comic is gonna struggle getting readers. But let's say you're 2 years in, you have like no readers, and you realize that, oh, it's not that great actually, I could do it better now. Like, you don't want to be running out of money at that point. Keep your job until you know that, okay, this is working, I can make it. That's a good way to do it. So anyway, in summary, traditional comics path, probably a bad idea. Very unstable careers even for the people who seemingly are successful and have their books published by established publishers. But going the indie route is possible, and a lot of people do find success. It's just very difficult, just as any other independent art career. Anyway, I think that's all I'm gonna be saying today. I could talk about this subject for ages, but I think it's a good time to wrap this video up. Let me know if you have any information you would like to add to the topic, or if you have some other topic you would like me to talk about for some other video. Anyway, I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.